Hello, and welcome to today's Climate Month webinar, Post-Disaster Housing Resilience in Greater New Orleans, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in partnership with the Smart Growth Network. My name is Jill Lemke, and I serve as the Manager of Planning and Engagement at the Maryland Department of Planning. I also serve as a member of the Smart Growth Network Steering Committee. The Smart Growth Network is a national alliance of advocates, practitioners, policymakers, and local leaders working toward a shared vision for land use and infrastructure policies and actions that result in healthy, equitable, sustainable, and prosperous communities for all. In addition to hosting webinars, we provide information on effective planning, development, and preservation practices. The Smart Growth Network website is undergoing a transition, so please stay tuned for updates. Today's webinar is one in a series of webinars hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning on sustainable growth and related topics. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted along with past webinars for viewing via the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov or by visiting your YouTube channel. The Department of Planning website also provides valuable information on planning initiatives, tools, and educational opportunities, including information on future webinars. While you are on our website, please subscribe to our newsletter to learn more about upcoming programming. It is important to note that the views expressed by the speakers are those of the speaker and not necessarily those of the Maryland Department of Planning, the State of Maryland, or the Smart Growth Network. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits or 1 Sustainability and Resilience Specialty credit from the American Planning Association. To receive your credits, please visit the APA's website, planning.org, to log into your account and search for the name of today's event. You can also search for the event number 9295757. Following the presentation, we will discuss as many questions as time permits. You could submit a question at any time by opening the Q&A tool in the Zoom control panel. Now, I am pleased to introduce our speakers for today. Carlos Martin is the director of the Remodeling Futures program, a lecturer at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and has over 25 years of experience researching housing technology and the physical quality of existing homes. Dr. Martin's research on housing adaptation to climate change, housing decarbonization, disaster mitigation and recovery, substandard housing, construction innovation, and the construction workforce connects the brick and mortar of existing housing to its social outcomes. Carlos came to the Joint Center from the Urban Institute, where he was a senior fellow. Previously, he was an assistant staff vice president for construction codes and standards at the National Association of Home Builders, a professor of energy and environment at Arizona State University, and coordinator for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's Partnership for Advanced Technology in Housing. Carlos is a fellow at the Brookings Institution and serves on several National Academy of Science committees. Carlos received a bachelor's degree in architecture from MIT and a master's and PhD degree in civil and environmental engineering from Stanford University. Claudia Solari is a senior research associate in the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center at the Urban Institute. There, she studies housing insecurity. Solari specializes in social inequality and demography with a focus on homelessness, low-income housing, mixed-income housing, neighborhood inequality, segregation, and housing crowding. She has worked on longitudinal social experiments, including the New Hope Project and the Family Option Study. Solari is trained in quantitative and mixed methods research, as well as survey design, evaluation, and large-scale data collection. She is skilled with large and small-scale project management and was project director of the annual Homeless Assessment Report to Congress. Solari received a BA from Brown University and her PhD in sociology from the University of California, Los Angeles. Catherine Burgess is the Vice President of Land Use and Development at Smart Growth America, where she oversees Smart Growth America's land use programs, including Locust, the Form-Based Code Institute, and the National Brownfields Coalition. Prior to Smart Growth America, Catherine led the Urban Resilience Program at the Urban Land Institute, where she built up the organization's program of work addressing how buildings, cities, and communities can better prepare for the impacts of climate change. An urban planner, Catherine has 15 years of experience practicing in the US, UK, and Germany. She began her career managing post-Katrina hurricane recovery charrettes commissioned by the states of Louisiana and Mississippi and the city of New Orleans. She has conducted research for the Landscape Architecture Foundation and the Robert Bosch Foundation Fellowship Program. She holds a master's degree in regional and urban planning from the London School of Economics and a bachelor's from Williams College. That is a very impressive speaker lineup. And now it is my pleasure to turn it over to Carlos, who will kick off the presentations. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Jill. It's a real pleasure to be joining all of you. And I do feel like I've had such a good time planning this event with the Department of Planning of Maryland, as well as the Smart Growth Network. And I've had especially a good time being in conversation with Catherine and Claudia, who you'll be hearing with in a bit. Speaking of timing, I think it's very important that we acknowledge the fact that in a couple of weeks it's going to be New York City Climate Week. So I find it fitting that we're speaking about home resilience at a time when we commemorate our home planet and our various home cities and towns. And so it brings me to an important prologue too that I find myself repeating every time I've given a presentation about climate and housing. And the findings that Dr. Solari and I will be presenting come from a multi-year study focused on existing homes in relation to climate change's effects. In simple terms, we're talking about climate adaptation. However, there is one fundamental way in which we can fully prepare our existing and future housing and communities from future damages and losses. And I'm referring to climate mitigation, including the mass decarbonization of existing homes. So we can stop or at least decelerate this escalation of further risk. And we would be remiss if we didn't start off this whole conversation by mentioning that reducing our housing's reliance on fossil fuels should be among the first steps taken as we simultaneously address the effects from climate change that we are already seeing. So more on that, I'm sure, in future webinars that the Maryland Department of Planning is putting on. But let me come back once again and more to the issue of timing, since in essence, our study's motivation is about how housing disparities in relation to climate risks have evolved in a single point in time in a specific place, and how that can shed light on the challenges that we'll be facing in every corner of this country. I'm sure you have listeners and viewers in this webinar who are coming from every parts of the country. So in our case, the time is the decade following Hurricane Katrina up to 2018, and our place is southeastern Louisiana. And this was particularly transformative in multiple ways. Katrina, as we know, in late August 2005, transformed New Orleans for many reasons, not only in the core fact that there were 800 deaths and $125 billion in damage. It led to significant confusion regarding repairs and recovery and realty transaction. Comes from the state's Road Home program through the wide range of charities that came to help to try to improve housing after the hurricane. This in turn led to disparities in recovery, often due to the presence or absence of insurance, as well as pre-storm home quality and value, and the racial composition of the neighborhoods in which homes stood. One critical example of how these disparities manifested was led by a partner on this very project that we'll be talking about, the Greater New Orleans Fair Housing Action Center, now known as Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center, who settled a class action lawsuit on behalf of Black homeowners with the federal and state governments in 2011 because the public recovery programs based household recovery on pre-Katrina household values rather than the cost of repairs. And we all know that pre-Katrina housing values had a long history of racial segregation and income disparity in a place like Louisiana. So another reason why Katrina was so transformative was that it led to demographic pivot for the region that still plays out today, and that is documented by many other long-term partners for this project, including the data center out of New Orleans. But Katrina was also really important, thinking about our entire country and how we respond to these kinds of events, and more importantly, prepare and mitigate for their damages. It showed a very poor emergency management response, but also showed that disparities in long-term recovery and that there are near lack of any major preparations and mitigations at a national level, especially at that time. It demonstrated the legacy of racism and wealth disparity, even in these public services, these emergency management services that we describe as neutral in the disaster response. And it brought to light our ailing U.S. infrastructure. So in so many ways, the magnitude and unprecedented nature of the new exposure due to climate change is manifesting and started out in the precedent that is Katrina. Our study focuses on the challenges, inequities, and opportunities for making existing housing and households in the greater New Orleans area more prepared. Now, all dimensions of housing adaptation that we will discuss today have evolved significantly since we did this data collection in our study, which ended during the pandemic. So let me quickly update you if you're not already glued to your news feed like I am, waiting for the multiple shoes of political, policy, market, and household behaviors to drop. Just in the last couple of years alone, we have seen current debates about how to assess risk in the housing markets, which in some cases has caused panic in some circles because of the lack of consistent and aligned policy and metrics to make sure our homes are better prepared for what is ahead. There has also been a proliferation of risk information sources and media reporting, often adding to confusion to new home buyers and renters without always illuminating the strategies for households that occupy the current housing in the more extremely exposed areas. And on a daily basis, from California to Florida, we are seeing percolations of what is often the first real signal of change to the households: insurance stories, premium increases, coverage decreases, and in some most dire of circumstances, lack of access altogether. Consequently, we're seeing advocacy around the kinds of information that can be made available to households prior to facing sticker shock or worse. There are news stories about risk information disclosures in particular that we have been tracking. Every part of the country will be experiencing this debate over risks and its ensuing overwhelming nature in the next few years. But more importantly, we will be seeing these stories play out very differently for different segments of the population, between owners and renters, between low, moderate, and high income households, and between white communities and communities of color that retain the scars of racism and segregation. But this is not exactly news to many folks in places like Florida after 1992's Hurricane Andrew, and in Louisiana after Katrina, who found that their housing and the infrastructure meant to protect those homes have been in limbo since these catalyzing events. The story goes back even further. There are precedents for how our housing institutions have considered or haven't considered environmental risks. The image that you see is from the Great Mississippi River flood of 1927 that inundated 16 million acres, displacing nearly 640,000 people, predominantly African American households, in states from Illinois all the way down to Louisiana. In Vicksburg, Mississippi alone, the river swelled to 80 miles wide. Damages from the flood led private insurers to conclude that insurance against the peril of flood cannot successfully be written. This eventually led to the creation of the National Flood Insurance Program 40 years later, which aimed to control the costs of post-disaster relief to the federal government, excuse me, and to motivate state and local governments to restrict building in high-risk areas. Insurance is one of a handful of tools at the disposal of households in already existing homes and communities. The state of these tools and their evolution at those critical tipping points started us on this journey. It is a study of this evolution that our team at the Urban Institute, as well as a group of nonprofits within the Louisiana area, proposed to the National Academy's Gulf Research Program to explore key dimensions of housing risk and, more importantly, housing resilience. The work was funded and begun in 2017, and it's an important timing note because it coincided with the first wave of public policy changes occurring in the post Hurricane Katrina era. The same and it happened in the same year that Hurricanes Maria and Harvey and the Thomas Fire occurred. But this also provided us the chance to look at 10 years of transformation and turmoil in our site. The greater New Orleans area, following the devastation of Katrina and the still unprecedented quantity of federal and state investments that were sent into the region. New Orleans is one of those cities that are now popularly conceived of as being the harbinger or omen, the canary in the coal mine. The rise of extreme precipitation of flooding risks, right, and to the right in the middle of the slide that you see, were a key reason for picking this site. But we were also very conscious of the region's housing and history, one of racial and income segregation and disparities in housing quality, housing protection, and as Katrina demonstrated, infrastructure and service protections. These histories are inextricably tied to the environmental change in Southeast Louisiana. And working with our local partners, we defined the Greater New Orleans housing market as the metro area encompassing 7 parishes. Our focus at that moment in time in New Orleans involved looking at all the tools at hand, but discussions with our local partners focused primarily on what current residents in existing owner-occupied housing could do. So we defined resilience by looking at Louisiana and New Orleans housing, demographic, infrastructure, and environmental history. We looked at disaster and climate vulnerability from the literature in sociology and environmental justice. And of course, we looked at housing's capacity physically from an engineering and construction standpoint to withstand, adapt, and thrive in the face of disaster, chronic and acute climate events, or environmental shocks. And that's how we chose to define housing resilience for this project. We narrowed the dimensions to 6 specific studies of resources because of the literature, but also because of the history and the communications that we had with our nonprofits in these areas. So there are 6 studies that are included in the broader project that will provide links to at the end of this. But today we're only going to be focusing on 2 of these. One is the history of post-Katrina planning and the perceptions therein. So that's the community engagement, the second dimension that you see on that list. And the second is insurance coverage. That's the pricing and treatment of insurance within the New Orleans area in this post-Katrina scenario. We relied on a large number of data sources. We interviewed and did focus groups involving about 140 individuals, and this included federal, state, and local officials, activists from the area, which played a key role in our community engagement study, and actual residents. There were a lot of secondary sources that we used for demographic information, the FEMA flood maps at 2 different points in time, and proprietary property level transaction data. And what we are particularly proud of is a survey of post-Katrina home buyers that we conducted with our local partners through multiple modes, utilizing a range of experimental, intensive, and recruitment techniques. And that included data collection during the early months of the pandemic shutdown. So we're proud of this, especially because there are virtually no non-proprietary sources about information related to insurance at the household level, and that can be matched directly to households' demography, perceptions, and actions. So there was a lot of challenges with this survey that we'd be happy to talk about. There was a lot of experimentation that Claudia could talk about in the Q&A, but our final sample ended up being 952 completed survey responses from households that purchased homes between 2008 and 2018 in that 7 parish area in New Orleans. So let me first talk about the community engagement study. So why is this relevant to housing? So one of the key concepts out in working with our local organizers, we realized that households attend community planning events because they're concerned with the land use and infrastructure decisions that will directly affect their housing and indirectly affect the determination of where protected infrastructure is that will protect their homes. So it's very important for us to understand how this specific community engagement evolved during this period of time in the post-Katrina area. And I'm going to skip to that planning background right now because there was so much planning that occurred. And hopefully we have folks from the New Orleans area that are listening today. There was a proliferation of planning, both for infrastructure and for land use decisions. This included the city's resilience strategy, and these were accompanied by federal support of over $233 million for things like HUD's National Disaster Resilience Competition. Now, all of these works came after years of generally fragmented urban planning efforts that produced the 2010 Master Plan and Comprehensive Zoning Ordinance. But since that time, community activists began posing questions about equity and plan participation, particularly around representativeness of the region's changing profile. So we were very conscious of the fact that there's a lot of interesting literature about community engagement and techniques of communication engagement. So we wanted to engage with our respondents on the ground about whether there were effective tools that occurred during these post-Katrina planning engagements. We looked at this is just a snapshot of many of the plans that we looked at, including those that were focused just in the city of New Orleans and the New Orleans parish, from the Resilience New Orleans plan that I just mentioned, down to things like the Housing NOLA plan, things that were had some recovery. They weren't directly about Katrina and Katrina recovery, but had some for which Katrina planning had some effect on their planning processes, and whether the range of community engagement strategies that were employed across all of these were effective and were representative of the communities involved. We looked at all of the other 7 parishes, and we also looked at a broad range of state and federally funded planning efforts in this area. So hopefully you can see this, and we'd be happy to this. There's a nice big image of this in the actual report, but we looked at to help the respondents understand which planning events, because there have been so many, we would provide these maps, these chronologies of the planning exercises that occurred in the post-Katrina era, and use this as a mnemonic to have people recall when and where the engagement activities occurred, who attended, and whether there was any documentation. One of the reasons we had to resort to this kind of data collection was because very few of the planning efforts that occurred maintained records of who attended, including just like basic sign-in sheets and that sort of thing. And in the cases that they did do this, which were again a fraction of all of the planning efforts that we looked at, that information was not available publicly to researchers. So we relied on these kinds of mnemonics and images to have people recall the effects, the quality of the engagement efforts. So there were some important contextual factors that came out while we were doing this that folks noted fairly regularly. One is that the demography changed in this region. So some of the people who may have attended at one point soon after Katrina may not be the same people attending in the later stages of our study, which was up to 2018. There was an abundance of uncoordinated planning efforts. So none of these efforts actually built off of each other's community engagement strategies. They all tended to be very segregated, planning efforts. So there was a lot of duplication and replication, which made a lot of the respondents feel that there was a lack of horizontal and vertical collaboration between the states, between the parishes, and between neighboring parishes, and in some cases, miscommunication between those and very siloed sort of planning strategies. And there was also some very strong sentiment about being deeply rooted, having a strong government distrust that was deeply rooted in the community in the post-Katrina effort. Certainly, a lot of this pre-existed Katrina in the Louisiana area. One side note that I want to mention is that we did have a lot of questions about social media and whether social media techniques were used in part of the community engagement strategy. And respondents were very quick to note that the social media strategies often resorted to a lot of misinformation and being taken over by people who were not representative of communities. And so those were often, in some cases, taken down within days after having been put up. So they weren't really part of our communication engagement analysis. There was a lot of reliance on outside consultants to do a lot of the engagement strategies, which many local organizers and community representatives felt was a disservice to the kind of quality of engagement and organizing that they had done in their own communities. And finally, there was a lot of engager and participant fatigue. You can imagine by that whole list of that chart of all the different plans. By halfway through, there were a lot of folks who were just tired of showing up to town halls and to charrettes, et cetera. So that played a big role, we believe, in some of the findings that we came out with. But here are some important things that we noted across all of the respondents that talked about the community engagement and what we were able to gauge from the actual planning documentation. Most of these were one-time interventions. We also looked at the things like hazard mitigation plans over that come out every 5 years from every parish and from the state. But the vast majority of the plans that we were looking at were these one-time interventions. And so there was a lot of dissatisfaction with sort of the lack of long-term community engagement strategy that or what many of the respondents felt was critical to having more effective planning engagement. I mentioned some of these more routine and administratively required plans like the hazard mitigation plans. And many of those, there was a strong sense that in some cases people didn't even know that they were happening. There was no real attempt to engage folks beyond what was perfunctorily required by statute, by federal statute, for example, or federal program rules around what should be constituted in the hazard mitigation plans community engagement. For example, putting an announcement up in the newspaper one time about the plan being available, sort of thing. So there's a lot of dissatisfaction with those routine ones as well. Among the engagement practices, the actual techniques that were associated with these plans, many of them were deemed very superficial. In many ways, they felt that they were ineffective in communicating technical detail, scientific and engineering detail to lay audiences. Many of the groups also felt that they were not representative of the underserved groups in these communities. Certainly, a lot of these organizations had to step up and be representative of a much wider group of people who were not able to attend town halls or to file a formal comment on a plan, et cetera. They also felt that in many cases there were predetermined outcomes by the state or local officials. In many cases, they presented a plan as if it was a done deal rather than an evolution that would be informed by the community engagement. So there were two notable exceptions I want to make sure that we're clear about, that respondents were made sure that we highlighted, and these were the LA Safe, the Louisiana project funded by the HUD's National Disaster Resilience Competition that was across the state of Louisiana and particularly in southeastern parishes, and the city of New Orleans Housing NOLA effort, which was described as a very long-term attempt to engage on a regular basis. So now I'm going to transition over to the second part of our presentation, which will be of insurance. I will just quickly review some of the context and the literature and then pass it over to my colleague, Dr. Solari. But it's important, I already sort of at the beginning of the presentation noted some of the major changes that you all are seeing across the country and the conversations that we're having in popular media around changes in insurance. Well, in Louisiana, like I said, Louisiana was the omen, the harbinger of a lot of this. Several insurers canceled their policies after Katrina. And so the state's insurer of last resort often have to expand, almost including the vast majority of respondents. This is the same thing we're seeing playing out in Florida and to a lesser extent in California. There were smaller insurance carriers that entered the market, partially due to the fact that a lot of the state's insurance commissioners offered a lot of concessions so that insurers would stay in the state. And this resulted in increasing policy stringency, policy meaning the actual coverage. There are many more restrictions on people's individual policy coverage, as well as higher premium rates. And this whole time, of course, there was a massive confusion about the National Flood Insurance Program. There was confusion about what flood risk maps showed that continued for the decade after Katrina. And this is well before our data collection, I want to be sure everybody knows, was well before Risk Rating 2.0. So even the increases in premium rates due to the more updated actuarial risks that I've shown. So we can talk a little bit more about the literature and insurance, but I do want to make sure that we have time to pass it on to my colleague. So I will sign off on my audio and pass it over to my colleague, Dr. Solari.
Thanks, Carlos. And can you just go back to that last slide for a sec more? Um, Great. So insurance policies and premiums are generally based on actuaries' models of estimated risk. However, this has not always been the case for general property insurance like homeowners policies or for hazard insurance. So previous studies suggested that possible racial disparities existed decades ago, but have since diminished, while others suggest that having flood insurance in pre-Katrina New Orleans varied by demographic characteristics. It's still unclear if disparities in insurance coverage and pricing exist by financial capacity. In Louisiana, for example, insurance quotes can factor in the policyholder's credit scores. Homeowner and hazard insurance remains a primary risk mitigation tool for housing and a critical housing resilience strategy, but it's increasingly less accessible as both insurance types are becoming more unaffordable to many households. So the key questions that we investigated here are, do different groups receive different insurance policies and premium rates, and are they treated differently in claims transactions? So let's talk about insurance coverage. As a reminder, we did ask our survey respondents to access their insurance information while taking the survey with the goal of having more accurate information and less missing data. We asked about what losses were covered for specific events across all of their insurance policies. And over 97% of homeowners were covered by loss due to fire, 94% had covered losses due to hurricane or windstorm, and about 83% had losses from flood due to natural disaster covered. The next slide, these are LOGIP models, and the results here are odds ratios, and we have some highlighted figures with stars here that represent coefficients that are statistically significant. So we have models that focus on whether race and ethnicity and income predict the level of insurance coverage for three hazards: flood due to a hazard event, hurricane or windstorm, and all perils combined. We control for location, sociodemographics, and having a past hazard experience. And what we find is when we take these controls into account, race and ethnicity does not significantly predict the level of insurance policy coverage, but income is more predictive. So homeowners with higher household incomes are over 6 times more likely to be covered for hurricane or windstorm losses compared to those with lower incomes. And higher income households are also twice as likely to have coverage for all perils or losses compared to those with lower incomes. So we saw that although only about 6% of homeowners have no coverage for damage from hurricane or windstorms, almost all of those were lower income households. And homeowners residing in a FEMA designated 100-year flood zone are 5 times more likely to have an insurance policy that covers flood damage from a disaster event, which is reassuring to see and what we'd expect. Note that neither race, ethnicity, nor income levels predict flood coverage. This is most likely because the NFIP leveled the playing field, securing flood insurance for all of those who need it. Also reassuring. It's also worth pointing out that those reporting having gone through a hazard experience in the past are 2 times more likely to have hurricane and wind losses covered. So shifting to pricing, we asked respondents to look at their annual flood insurance premiums, their homeowners insurance premiums, and then the highest value deductible across all of their policies. And overall, the median annual homeowner insurance premium was about $2,270, and the median annual flood insurance premium was about $500. For homeowners within a flood zone, the median annual flood insurance premium was about $750 compared to $475 for the homeowners that lived outside of a flood zone. When looking at the highest value deductible across all the policies, the median highest deductible was $2,580. Higher income households had higher deductibles, and they also had higher homeowners and flood insurance premiums. White homeowners also have a higher deductible and homeowners insurance premiums, but for flood insurance, households of color reported having a slightly higher annual flood insurance premium. So now looking at this in a regression model, again, focusing on race and income, controlling for location, sociodemographics, and items related to other insurance behavior and mitigation actions. And again, the figures highlighted with stars are those that are statistically significant. We find that higher income households pay significantly more for their annual homeowners insurance premium by about $290 compared to lower income households. But the coverage limit is significantly higher by about $27,000. And as a reminder, the coverage limits are the maximum amount of money an insurance company will pay off for a covered claim. So that means that every dollar spent in annual premium translates to about $90 in added coverage for higher income households. And households of color pay significantly less by about $255 for their annual homeowners insurance premium compared to white non-Hispanic households, but they also have significantly lower coverage by about $41,000 compared to white households. So even though households of color are paying less annually for their premiums, every dollar they pay less translates to about $160 less in coverage. We saw no statistically significant differences in race or income in predicting flood insurance premiums. And the model predicts with statistical significance that homeowners located in a flood zone pay on average about $430 more for their annual flood insurance premium than homeowners located outside of the flood zone, controlling for those other factors. So we did also explore claims outcomes. We asked about the outcome of a claim that was based on the most significant claim in their lifetime. So we do have a much smaller share of our sample that reported ever filing a claim. But for those who did, 83% reported that those were fully paid or mostly paid off. Higher income households reported higher levels of payment outcomes for their claims compared to lower income households. And white households have had their reported claims paid in full or mostly paid at a higher rate than households of color. And households living in a flood zone who filed claims had higher rates of poor claim outcomes, like being denied, minimally paid, or partially paid, compared to those who were not in a flood zone. And among those who had claims, we looked at the type of service and the level of satisfaction they had as it relates to that most significant claim filed in their lifetime. And we also looked at overall satisfaction with their current homeowners insurance company among those who with insurance. So we looked at whether race or income predict the level of service, controlling for location, sociodemographics, and other controls like insurance shopping frequency and other coverage and claim behavior and outcomes. So here for claim time, that refers to a grouped number of months it took for the insurance provider to process that claim. And for both claim satisfaction and homeowners insurance satisfaction, we measure that from very dissatisfied to very satisfied on a 5-point scale. And this table here is presenting odds ratios from ordered LoJITs. Again, the statistically significant figures are highlighted here. And what we find is that household income is positively associated with the quality of claims processing. So higher income households are significantly more likely to face shorter claim processing time and are nearly 3 times more likely to have higher levels of satisfaction with the claims process. We also see that households of color are 59% less likely to be satisfied with their claims process compared to white households. And we do have, again, larger sample sizes for the homeowners insurance satisfaction, and we see that households of color are 34% less likely to be satisfied with their current homeowners insurance company compared to white households. And with that, I'll pass that to Carlos.
Thank you so much, Dr. Solari. And so, just in summary, we want to make sure that we're very clear that there have been a lot of changes since we collected this data and did the analysis on this study. We mentioned the changes in insurance that almost every state in this country is starting to experience. We've talked about the community engagement strategies that have changed, particularly in the last 4 years with regard to Justice 40 federal interventions and the Thriving Communities TA efforts. But in each of the 6 studies that we looked at, there has been massive changes that have occurred. So happy to talk about that in the Q&A a little bit more for each of the 6 studies, but we just want to make sure that we're providing you the resources that we've talked about in this report. It's a very long report, so we also encourage you to read the summary if you don't have the time to read the entire full report, but it's available on the Urban Institute website. The data as well as the survey instrument are also available. And we just want to close out by first off thanking the National Academies Gulf Research Program for funding this report and supporting us through the effort. The entire research team, particularly Dr. Solari, all of our advisors that play different roles in each of the 6 studies, all of the folks who spoke to us, including all the local officials and the community organizers. But we especially want to pay attention to our local partners. When we looked at the community engagement strategy, we wanted to, of what was occurred in the past plans, we also wanted to make sure that we weren't exacerbating a lot of the problems that in our research from as those that were committed during these planning processes. So we involve groups. I mentioned Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center, Taproot Earth, which was formerly known as the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy, Louisiana Language Access Coalition, Mary Queen of Vietnam, CDC, and the Data Center on Louisiana, all of whom not only helped us create and design this study, but actually were involved in the survey delivery and doing everything from door-to-door, door knocking, and managing a hotline. And with that, I want to thank you, and I'm more than happy to pass the mic to our colleague, Catherine Burgess, who also would like to expand on some of the work that she's been doing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martin and Dr. Solari, for presenting your incredibly impressive and robust work. And thanks to everyone for joining us today and for all of the engagement and dialogue and discussion, which is already coming through in the Q&A, including at least one comment from a New Orleans resident. So thank you everyone for being here today. I'm Catherine Burgess, and I lead the land use team at Smart Growth America. We're a national nonprofit focused on advancing sustainable, equitable development and better connecting land use, transportation, and climate policies. And with that, I will pull up my screen. I've put together a few quick slides to share my current work and the perspective that I bring to it as we then move into a discussion of this research. And part of the reason I'm here is that I started my career working post-Katrina and observing much of the dysfunction of the planning processes, really led me to choose to work in policy and to advocate for changes to the planning and climate adaptation processes. With that, let me pull up the PowerPoint. 1 second, just getting this into presenter mode. Is that coming through okay? I hope so. So I'll get things moving. So I've introduced Smart Growth America, And our programmatic priorities, which we see as sort of the long-term impact of land use and transportation reform, are first addressing the climate crisis, considering both mitigation and adaptation. We heard that in the opening remarks from Dr. Martine regarding the urgent need to reduce emissions as well as adapt to the climate impacts which we are experiencing more and more day to day. Next, to advance racial equity by dismantling the discriminatory processes, especially in land use and housing policy, which have led to segregation, lack of economic opportunity, and lack of wealth building opportunity. Then finally, we see better connecting land use, transportation, and climate policy as leading to healthier community outcomes, especially considering active transportation, connectivity, and the better sense of community connection, cohesion, and mental health from having strong shared civic spaces and public open spaces. So as I mentioned at the front end of this call, at the very beginning of my career, I spent about 2 years being involved in a wide variety of different post-Katrina planning initiatives led by the state of Mississippi, state of Louisiana, and city of New Orleans, as well as a number of pro bono community-based organization projects and other projects which resulted from spending a lot of time in post-Katrina New Orleans. As you've already heard, and as I observed as a young practitioner, these efforts were often incredibly siloed. They often led to a huge amount of planning fatigue and over engagement expectations when folks had really lost everything and were at the most vulnerable state that you can imagine. Here are a couple picks that I found from when I was back doing site visits in advance of some of the community planning charrettes. As a young practitioner, I was especially moved by the amount of community commitment and the sort of culture and love of the city. It is a really incredible place. And again, people had really lost everything and still took the time to engage in many of these processes, which were often asking too much of people. So I share with you here where I sat in this long timeline of projects, which we saw earlier in the presentation. I was working with an urban design firm, which worked with both the Louisiana Speaks work, that was state level work that worked in a number of locations across the state, as well as with the Unified New Orleans Plan, which matched different design firms with different neighborhoods or districts, as it was called in the planning process. Working at that time led me to be very familiar with all of both the dysfunction of and the perceptions of the prior planning initiatives since the storm. And then it led me to continue to follow the work in the region over the long term as I continued in my career. So what did I observe? And I share this mostly to share my perspective before moving into some discussion around the research. First, as a young planning practitioner, I was really struck by that level of destruction and loss and seeing the compounding effect of discriminatory and racist land use policy on neighborhoods and communities across the city, many of which were extremely segregated. Next, seeing that dysfunction of the multiple planning processes, often a lack of clear information for residents and planning fatigue. Even as consultants coming in, we observed a lack of information and at times changed the plan of what we had come in to do to really start at the beginning around sort of context setting and key resources because there was often a lack of information. Personally, I saw a huge amount of commitment of resident-led community-based organizations, some of which were formed in response to the plans, as well as plans which had not been strong in engagement and which had not actively sought the input of residents. And then finally, as we're wrapping up the climate month here for this webinar series, there, at least in the rooms that I was in, there was not a lot of focus on climate change or recognizing the anticipated current and future impacts of climate change versus overall higher level discussion around infrastructure preparedness. So I think we are in a different place today, and at the very end of the conversation, we've even had a recognition of the different data sources that are available now, policy changes, federal programs available now, which already differ from the study period. But as we look at an almost 20-year difference from Katrina to now, I see first, an increased acknowledgement across the field and more generally of both the urgency of the climate crisis and its disproportionate impact on underserved communities and communities that have been disadvantaged by discriminatory policy. We see a better understanding of and more funding and tools for climate adaptation, including the proliferation of data sources, which we heard about at the front end of this discussion. And then finally, as sort of an evolving dynamic, which I believe has really accelerated since the Urban Institute study, an incredibly intense housing need and a national housing access crisis in which there is an incredible need for more affordable, low and moderate income housing, in particular, housing in locations where people are served by transportation, jobs, high quality schools and civic resources, a greater need for housing than ever before, and yet this recognition of the extent of vulnerability to climate impacts in many locations. And in preparing for this, had the opportunity to take a look at the current New Orleans Housing Ecosystem Plan, which was put out this summer. So, that's yet another data point in that journey of plans that we saw earlier today, which looks at the incredible need for housing, the challenge for long-term residents in maintaining housing, and also looks at the change in the insurance environment. And so this plan puts together a number of goals, looking at land use reform, strategies to invest in affordability, and to strengthen the overall housing ecosystem. I'll note that within the plan, there is a focus on a concept of climate-ready infill, although that's not necessarily defined, which could be a good initial line of discussion for us. So with that, I'm going to stop the share and move to some questions that the three of us discussed in advance of this presentation, and we're really excited to then continue to build from that with the audience questions that we already have available in the Q&A. And I believe we are all now coming off no video. Okay, I think we're all here. Wonderful to see you both. And thank you again for that really robust presentation of the research methods. You really walked through years of research, and I think in a really accessible and compelling way. And to get us started, it'd be great to talk about where we are now. The whole theme of this presentation today is around housing resilience. So how do you define that in the context of the current housing access crisis? And how do you think New Orleans and other cities can learn from this as we both recognize the need for housing and the vulnerability of existing housing stock and the experience community members have had in the face of climate events?
Yeah, and so I presented the definition for housing resilience that we use in the study with regard to being able to adapt and thrive in a wide range of future scenarios. The reality is the one question that underlies all of that is that there's housing that is available for anybody, right? And that's the underlying question I think that's facing every community in the United States, just from the current standpoint, climate agnostic. With climate effects, it becomes even more acute because we have houses that come offline. We have people moving from one place to another. So I think the housing resilience, we were very particular and noted that we were focusing on existing housing in existing communities in the post-Katrina scenario, and not necessarily on buyouts. And even though there were a lot of buyouts that occurred in Louisiana, or movement or displacement of houses. And that's a sort of the next big frontier that we're still trying to figure out, because right now it's still very much, I'd say, trickle effects of housing that people are, particularly after an acute event, are going to move and then want to come back to their community as quickly as possible. In some cases, that takes up to 2 or 3 years, particularly for renters, because once a rental property is offline, it's going to be offline for quite some time, and that always takes longer to rebuild. So hopefully that answered sort of the long-term question that, I mean, this is, I believe, a work in progress. So our definition was very much just for this study, but I think it's evolving as we speak. Claudia?
Yeah, and maybe just to add to that, when in defining housing resiliency, we're talking about like the condition of a home, but it's really also about the collection of homes in space, in different pockets of the region. It's also about how homeowners across the region have equitable housing resilience and access to resilience strategies to meet their needs. Um, in our survey, we touched on several strategies for housing resilience, including protections like, having quality insurance, and having sufficient coverage for, the most relevant risks, but also having had, proper information and disclosures prior to the home purchase. And that mitigation actions have been taken, like having the home elevated, fortifying roofs, having storm shutters, as well as like other kind of immediate hazard event responses, like having a generator, having your important documents all ready to go and together, and having an evacuation plan. So it's multifaceted. But really, um, the need to address affordable housing really has to be paired with that need for resilient housing.
Great. Well, thank you both for that overall framing. You've just covered even more, I think, of the depth and breadth of the report. So today you mostly spoke about the planning processes, community engagement, and the insurance data and findings, which I thought was, really much needed. Thank you for that work. I noted your point earlier around the lack of non-proprietary data available. One thing we didn't have a chance to talk very much about today is the research findings on infrastructure protection. And the report found disparities along racial lines, with white non-Hispanic residents facing less exposure than communities of color. Can you speak to your research on this and what your recommendations are for the city to establish a more equitable approach to infrastructure investment?
Yeah, and that was a particularly hard bit of study to do because, any infrastructure that's proposed, it's in plan that is projecting where it's going to protect, right? The levees, the seawalls, the dams, the river redistributions. These are all in plan, and very rarely have we seen the Army Corps, for example, or any other federal institution or a state-funded infrastructure project actually testing out if whether those are the exact places that are protected. We've seen time and time again that, in fact, places that were supposed to have been protected weren't. This is Katrina being, of course, the most obvious example of this with the seawall, with the sea gates, excuse me. So I think when it comes to infrastructure investment, it's absolutely important to think about two things. One is just fairness, like who is this covering as much of the population as possible, as evenly as possible, right? And then two, are we prioritizing those places that have been historically underserved and have been overexposed historically? I'm very comforted by FEMA, the BRIC program, the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities programs, that has included equity criteria as part of its scoring for the applications that come in, as well as the Army Corps really trying to work with communities in places like Miami, in the whole Miami-Dade County area to really rethink after they've had some very obvious examples of creating infrastructure that really prioritizes high-value property, and high-value property communities, which of course doesn't include all of the communities that we are most concerned about that are often the most vulnerable. So I think there are experiments that are occurring right now on the infrastructure side. Just as a quick side note, before we get to the next question, it was a challenge for us not only because these projects are predictive of what's going to be protected, but there's major demographic change, right? That's occurring in these same places. So by the time something's built, by the time a hurricane happens, the communities that existed in these places are very different than during the planning phases, right? This is particularly true in a place like the southeastern Louisiana now. That has changed so significantly in terms of its racial and income composition. Excuse me, I keep coughing. I must have little Katrina in my chest today. So that's just a couple of responses to that question, Catherine.
Dr. Solari, would you like to weigh in too, or shall we keep moving with all
Let's
the
keep
questions
moving. Yeah.
Great. So I'll ask a question that actually builds from a lot of what I'm seeing in the Q&A as well. So you had a key finding around the level of engagement, distrust, and the real the challenges that residents were facing in the engagement process beyond everything over and above they're experiencing personally after the storm. This is a big question, but let's try it. To hear from you both what you think would have been a more higher quality, genuine, and non-extractive process, and also while we're at that, be great to hear a little bit more how you designed this research process in light of what you were seeing in the local community ecosystem. I'll share one anecdote too before we move into this, also trying to catch as much as I can from the Q&A because there's already 30 questions, so I imagine it'll be challenging to get through them with Jill next. Someone had asked, like, what did you take away, as someone new to the city working in terms of the culture and engagement environment? I absolutely, fell in love with the neighborhood-based, approach to culture, celebrations, local businesses and music, but also just the focus on gathering and spending high quality time together. And something which I think really worked for us as a design team in the post-Katrina environment is my group decided to start hosting like dinners and gatherings in addition to what was kind of mandated as part of the official process. And all the people that came to the events and community members were invited to anything. And that's really when we had the opportunity to get to know people. And that is what led, I think, us as a team to have to have more successful synergy. This is still all within the context of a very dysfunctional and multi-layered planning process. But what I took away, one of the key things I took away from that time was that connection, which I think is quite special to New Orleans. So with that big question, let's start with Dr. Solari, both looking at hallmarks of a better process and how you translated this in terms of designing the research process.
Thanks for that great question. I'm actually going to focus on like in the context of the survey because this is such a huge project, and I'll let Carlos talk about like broader picture. But we were fully aware going into this that residents in this area suffered from survey fatigue, and also just for being asked to give their time, thoughts, and reflections on a trauma without really receiving very much in return. So one key way for us through the survey effort to build trust was partnering with the now Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center, which is a trusted local civil rights organization. And we had them review all of our survey content, including how to tailor the questions to the specific local context. We did train those staff into how to administer the survey. So when people called in to take the survey, it was, local folks that they were familiar with. We also made that organization the home base for our survey hotline. So if anyone had questions or concerns about the survey, they would also be speaking to, the local organization. We put their logo on all of our outreach materials. All of the text that we had, like our introductory letter was, signed by the executive director. And we also made sure that on the LAFAC website that they had an announcement that the survey was out there, even though we had a special preset sample that we were reaching out to. But all of these kind of were to validate that, this is a real thing, and it's coming from, in strong partnership with a very trusted organization. We also, in our invitation materials, we tried to let them, kind of realistically know what we were going to do with the information. We didn't want to overpromise anything, but we, did highlight that we wanted to have their comments and thoughts kind of factor into decision making. And we also offered them $50 for completing the survey, as well as, obviously ensuring their privacy and all of that. Carlos, you want to supplement?
Yeah, I'll just add, so even in the focus group respondents were also compensated. And this is an underlying principle, I think, that at least Dr. Solari and I always believe in, and is that particularly community group organizations, the organizers who came, that they're respected, that their knowledge and wisdom is respected and is not extracted. We're not extracting from them. So we're compensating them, we're paying them for being these conduits to communities. And that was one of the recommendations that they had about the formal state and local government planning processes, that instead of just putting a newspaper ad up to come to X town hall, they could actually work with community groups and compensate those community groups for helping coordinate and organize the messaging, the communications around it. So some of the things that you said, Catherine, resounded in the groups that we spoke to about building, you're working at the speed of trust with these communities, right? And so it's a question of working with community groups that have been around, leaders that have been around for quite some time and have developed pre-existing trust and community, and compensating them for their knowledge and their ability. I mean, these community organizers know how to translate technical information to lay audiences, right? That's what they do on a day-to-day basis. And so really valuing that, as well as making sure that evaluating it in all senses, financially as much as intrinsically, but also then utilizing that as a real tool. And so those two examples of community engagement processes were really around unique and creative ways of doing that translation, which was LA Safe, as well as really developing these long-term trust building opportunities, which was the housing NOLA plan that we discussed. And all the community organizations talked about those unique tweaks. So in the report, you'll see that we have a lot of recommendations about how to do better community engagement. I realize in the planning world, this is the bête noire. Like, how do we do this in an effective way that gets us to the end? So I would actually throw the question back to you too, Catherine, around these community engagement processes, because I feel like so much of the challenge that we have is time bound when it comes to climate issues. We have a certain amount of time to start making decisions about where we put infrastructure, where we put housing, where we do land use, because in 20 years, the effects are going to be that much worse. But it takes a lot of time to build that trust. So in your fascinating personal experiences, did you talk about that? Like, how do you build trust while still get something done at the end of it?
Well, I think when we were preparing for this, you had asked how to balance the urgency post storm event like that with the need to build trust. And first, I think after a storm event like that, where people have lost everything, it's too late. The trust needs to be in place before there's a crisis like that, in which everyone is incredibly vulnerable and the stakes are so high. So I know that's not really an answer for this, for the whole planning environment 20 years ago, but I have been, heartened to see change in the planning profession, the focus on long-term partnerships, partnering with community-based and resident-led organizations, the federal opportunities right now, which are designed for climate adaptation investments and land use strategy investments that residents want to see. So it's not, we're going beyond looking at how to consult community-based organizations and residents, and instead looking at strategies to fund what people want to see and know that they need in their communities. So I think that's positive. But again, looking back at, at the post-Katrina environment, when I came in to begin work in New Orleans, many of the residents were still really reeling from one of the very first very public plans that people called the Green Dot Plan, in which there were green dots indicating potential future green space. And how could you not be afraid to see people coming in from out of town and proposing potential destruction or lack of investment in your home and your neighborhood? And then for that to be the starting point for engagement after years and years of distrust led to, an environment in which, so it was a very, very difficult planning environment. That's a little bit, thank you for turning it back to me. I'll quickly turn it back to you before we go to Jill again, I'm trying to get to as many questions from the audience as possible, knowing we can't get to them all.
There are a lot of great questions out there.
Yeah, you alluded to what was really different with the two positive examples of engagement that you found from this study. Do you mind just building on that a bit, since it's something that we heard from the audience?
Yeah, and I already mentioned a little bit for LA Safe, the level of exercise planning, not just here's a presentation of what the project we want to build is, and this technical detail about it, this is how it's going to affect you. Some thumbs up or thumbs down, which is sort of the worst version of community engagement and participation that we hear about, right? But that still happens quite frequently. So actually planning exercises so people are designing their own infrastructure projects, right? Obviously with some assistance from technical service providers, but that they have a stake in what their future is going to look like and envisioning what that is absolutely critical. So that was a big lesson from LA Safe. And from Housing NOLA, it was really about this long-term credibility. It's really understanding that there's already knowledge and value in these communities that you're working in, that bringing in an outside consultant to come and try to get information from people isn't appropriate. We're very self-conscious about this as researchers who were based in Washington, D.C. at the time of our study, which is why we worked so actively with our local network to make sure that they were the face, and not just the face, but they actually helped design our study. They helped implement our study, and including the survey. So that, and they've helped deliver the messaging after the fact. So they were the first ones we went to after our analysis was done. We provided the reports for them. We gave them slides to do their own community engagement activities around and that sort of thing. So it really is about respecting that local knowledge as part of the process. And I accidentally pressed answered to one of the questions that was in the room, but it was let me just answer it. So the question was a clarifying question. It's the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center is the name of the organization who was the center of the survey implementation. And I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you. And I'll ask one more question, which I think alludes to a lot of what we're seeing in the Q&A before we pass it to Jill for Dr. Solari. As we're talking both about the process and about the nature of quality of safety of existing housing, as we're looking at housing resilience, and saw that a key theme from the work is the need to further invest in retrofits, and how retrofits are generally underutilized due to cost barriers. So it'd be great to hear, and also in light of the insurance findings, what your thoughts are on how retrofits could be less out of reach.
Yeah, and I appreciate you lifting up that particular result, because we found that 2/3 of recent homeowners took no actions of any kind to mitigate the effect of disaster to their home. We also found a general lack of awareness for certain state and local programs, like tax deductions for voluntary retrofits or tax credits for storm shutters. So really, based on what we had found, that affordable and resilient housing development needs to be supported financially through federal and state appropriations, with more stringent regulations around how non-resilient homes are financed, and with improved formula and competitive grant programs that foster better state and local policies to ensure that sufficient resources are diverted to house the most vulnerable households in resilient housing. Any actions that do take place need to be well communicated to all people in the region, since we found that lack of awareness. And we do feel like affordability and higher housing quality are possible. But I might even sort of pass a question back to you, Catherine, because, that recent plan that just came out is really talking about, affordable housing crisis. And there is that kind of conflict of, the need to build resilient housing, but that the cost is quite high. So just curious how you think about this trade-off at this current point in time.
Well, I'll say first, and I know, that Dr. Martine's an expert on this as well, that we're facing a real supply challenge right now. So I think we're looking as an organization at strategies to address the supply challenge while maintaining a focus on resilient locations, locations that are well served by transit and jobs, and strategies for, encouraging building design that is, forward looking and anticipating future risk as well as current risk. I think, there's no easy answer right now, though. There are a lot of federal resources that are currently available. So that's a positive glimmer in time, but it's still, I think it's still a very complex landscape. I was heartened reading the housing ecosystem plan at the layered approach in New Orleans and seeing, the commitments and the progress over the years, say, inclusionary zoning, et cetera. So looking at the city taking steps forward from a policy perspective. I think something that's challenging, back to the theme around silos, is I think the housing plan, on the face of it, as someone who's reading it as a, an outsider, I didn't see very much of a recognition of climate hazards or climate adaptation issues. It was, sort of referenced in terms of buzzword, but there wasn't any, there were not any recommendations around how to achieve that. I'll pass it to you, Dr. Martine, and then you should, if you don't mind, we'll pass it back to Jill to make sure we have a broader array of questions. And thank you, everyone. I'll also say my email is in the slide deck, and encourage anyone to reach out individually after this event as well, because it's impossible to get to everything, which is great. We have a really engaged audience today.
There's some amazing questions. You're absolutely right, Catherine. And so I just want to add very quickly, being somebody who is trained as an architect and an engineer, the physical quality of our communities and our housing is absolutely near and dear to my heart. And I feel like in some cases, what we are doing is actually buying time by doing more mitigation in those places. But buying time ain't that bad, right? We're talking about buying time in terms of generations, so that allows for some housing to stay on the market, to be occupied, and to potentially withstand a wide swath of different hazards and reduce that amount of damage and human suffering that occurs. So I'm all about buying time. The question is, how much time can we buy, and who can afford to pay for that buying, which is the big issue. Then, so I'm heartened by things like the Fortified Homes program, because in theory, if somebody's going to do something to their home, their insurance premiums should be reduced, right? So it's making the home more affordable. So it's the equivalent of doing like an energy retrofit, right? Is that you're going to be saving on your utility bills, and so you're going to make that investment in new windows or in a heat pump, etc. So it's the same thing should be occurring with our insurance policies. But that means all the beneficiaries of that, including private insurers, should be willing to pay their part of that expense. And with that, with that note about buying time, I will pass the few moments of time that we have back to Jill. And Jill, you're going to have a hard time ciphering through all of these really great questions.
It's true. Thank you all for sharing your experiences and your research on the links between housing and climate resilience. Throughout the presentation, we have been assembling questions. You can continue to submit questions throughout the discussion. And I will just say that after the webinar, we do share the questions with the speakers, so they will have an opportunity to respond individually. So let's get started. Carlos and Claudia, you mentioned that there's a lack of non-proprietary home insurance data. The availability of such data would be very helpful, even on a small geographic level. Given that, should state insurance regulating agencies consider this to improve our understanding of risks and outcomes? And do you know if this is being considered anywhere in the country or in New
I
Orleans?
Yeah, I have. This is one of my favorite questions because it's a very polemic and controversial one. So, in cases like Louisiana after Katrina, I mentioned the concessions that the insurance commissioners made with the private insurers. One of those is to limit the amount of reporting data that the private insurers do to the insurance commissioner, to the point where when we started the study, we had access to parish and zip code level average median insurance premium prices in the state of Louisiana. By the end of the study, that data is no longer required of insurance folks. And so there's a big concern about what the state insurance commissioners that dictate so much of insurance coverage and premium and treatment actions play a role in. So I'm very concerned about that because the exact same thing is happening in Florida. The exact same thing is now happening in the state of California, the amount of concessions that are going on. At the federal level, there's a little known office, the Office of the Federal Insurer in the Department of Treasury, that was created by the Dodd-Frank Act. That was a whole purpose was just to monitor what state insurance commissions are doing and the state of insurance commissions. A year and a half ago, they proposed as part of the President Biden's climate executive order for every agency that they proposed doing a national survey of property owners and their insurance. When that was proposed, there were House and Senate Republicans, and I'm being very conscious of the fact that all our institutions are nonpartisan organizations. But there were Republicans in both the House and Senate that proposed eliminating the Office of the Federal Insurer, just for the very act of saying, let's get some data out there so we can start making decisions. There have been some interesting studies trying to figure out how you can gauge insurance, individual household insurance from things like housing mortgage data that I'm very excited about that have been happening, but it is a real concern. And this is something we need. We don't have enough data.
Great, thank you.
I'll just add one thing to that, which is that if you go through, it's referenced both in our summary report and our full report, that we have some data available on Urban Institute's data catalog from this study. So you can see the survey instrument, and there's a data dictionary with tabulations for all the questions in the survey available.
The link is on the last slide of our presentation.
Okay. Thank you. And we will be sharing the video, will be posted online. And if the speakers share their slides with us, we will be posting those as PDFs underneath the video at the end of the webinar. We have a series of questions from a New Orleans resident. The first one is, has the research team revisited any of their survey data relating to property insurance in the wake of the collapse of the Louisiana property insurance market in 22 to 23? And if so, are there any insights or patterns that might have emerged?
The answer is no,
Okay.
because we collected our data between of the surveys within the time frame in question. So that's why we're very conscious of like saying that everything that we collected, it's such a fast moving target in places like Louisiana, Florida, Texas, and California. And the reality is now it's in the rest of the country as well, that we want you to learn from what happened in Louisiana with regards to the insurance policies as a harbinger of what's going to happen in other places. But we haven't been able to collect that new data or compare it. But certainly the same lessons apply, that there is a real concern about the availability and the access of coverage, knowing that there are disparities in coverage and treatment by income in particular are particularly disconcerting.
What sounds like it's a call for future researchers who might be on the call to look into that for us.
Amen. Or if there are any funders on the call, feel free to call Dr. Solari and me up.
Excellent. Looking back on the example of the NFIP and the flood of 1927, the New Orleans resident, as well as another viewer, have asked if there is a role for pushing for changes in public policy. What policy levers might exist at the federal and state levels to address the challenges in the insurance market? And what are your recommendations for future policy or policy interventions to improve resilience, either with respect to insurance or other types of policies and programs?
Yeah. So I think all of us can speak about the wide range of other policies. Just to start off with the insurance question, and this is, I know Dr. Solari is smiling because she knows my response to this repeatedly. I mean, we do have to have a conversation in this country about property insurance, akin to the conversation we had 10 years ago about healthcare insurance. The reality is it's becoming absolutely unaffordable, and nobody really knows what's in their policies, right? Half the time people didn't. That's why we actually spent a lot of time at the beginning of the study doing focus groups just to understand how much people knew or didn't know about their insurance policies. And the reality is even highly educated, high income people, it's like when you get your annual healthcare coverage booklet. You know, I don't know. Once I get sick, I'll look up if I'm qualified. It's the same thing with your property insurance. And I would urge folks to look at Professor Daniel Schwartz and his work on what do people actually know about their insurance. Some amazing work. And of course, Dr. Carolyn Kuski, who was the advisor to our project, has done some amazing studies on what things that we could do. So the conversation has been a growing conversation around, do we need a national property insurance, or at least coverage of some of the hazards, like we have the National Flood Insurance Program. There are only two examples right now that we have that are equivalent. One is the National Flood Insurance Program, and the other is the California Earthquake Authority. California Earthquake Authority is voluntary, generally voluntary, with a few exceptions. National Flood Insurance only if you live in a flood zone or your mortgage lender require you to get National Flood Insurance, right? So it sees the seepage of people who don't get it, who may not be in the flood zone, but the way the flood zones are dictated needs that change as well, right? Because basically everything is becoming a hazard area. So one is, do we have that conversation about a public option for property insurance? A second is, at least with the National Flood Insurance Program, this is one that Dr. Kuski and I have been promoting for quite some time, there has to be a means-tested assistance program, right? If people who bought a home 30 years ago, not knowing any of the flood risk, not even having that exposure, are now facing quadruple premiums, there should be an assistance program for those of a certain low income and moderate income households, so that they could actually maintain their homes with incentives for doing more mitigation, for buying time, so that they're not creating a major risk for the national coffers, right? So I think there are a lot of little things like that in the insurance world that we could do. And now, Catherine and Clyde, if you want to talk about the wide range of infrastructure, land use, et cetera.
I'm happy to chime in, but I'm guessing we only have time for one or two more questions. So maybe, Jill, we could.
Sorry, I went too long.
A couple more. No,
I got on my soapbox.
No,
that's okay. I do have one final question before we go into the opportunity for you all to give final remarks. And if you wanted to look at the other questions that you might be able to easily answer, we can do that as well. What recommendations do you have in helping to de-silo planning conversations? I know you talked a lot about this, but do you have any recommendations, especially in places where governments have limited capacity and resources?
You want to take that, Catherine?
Yeah, I'll jump in first. I think this is always one of the top recommendations around adaptation, housing, other planning processes. And it's a top recommendation because it's not necessarily easy to fix instantaneously. I think something that I've been heartened to see in the current environment is more of an integration and encouragement of desilozation around funding opportunities. So say if a local government is applying for infrastructure funding, incentives for local governments that have pro-housing policies in place or have a commitment to assess their current zoning to create more housing abundance in near future infrastructure investments. So that's one where structurally there's an incentive to de-silo that land use and transportation planning. So I think that's one effective example. But I think again, it's when we're looking even at that slide of the number of different planning initiatives underway, and you think of the extent of engagement requirements, time of community members, but also time of the city staff and the professionals supporting the delivery of these plans, you think of how much more efficiency you could identify if there was more of a streamlined or a synergistic approach.
Right. Claudia, did you want to add anything or no? All right, so we are running out of time, and I apologize that we did not get to everyone's question, although we had a lot of really great questions, so we wouldn't have gotten to them all anyway. I would like to give each of our speakers the opportunity to give some closing remarks. And as I always ask at the end of each webinar, if you don't have closing remarks, if you could just share with us any advice you might have for those of us in the field who are or may become burnt out and overwhelmed by the complexity of the issues. Catherine, do you want to start?
Yeah, two big questions around, it's the end of the summer, right? So I'll start with the burnout. I think many people are drawn to planning because we really care about a place-based approach and community and neighborhoods. And that's something which I do to avoid burnout, just being reminded of the value of going to that park, going to that community event, going to that downtown where everyone can cross paths. That motivates me, especially working in policy where it's a really long road to get to a different built environment outcome. And in closing remarks, I'll also just say, yeah, thank you to Dr. Martine and Dr. Solari. I think your work, it's incredibly impressive, and I'm also hopeful that it can be used in the forward-looking policy environment that we're in now, especially in addressing the housing access crisis in a city with a lot of climate exposure to climate hazards and residents that are exposed.
Okay. Carlos?
And I'll just end on behalf of Dr. Solari and me, saying that we started this project knowing that what happened in New Orleans post-Katrina was the harbinger for what's happening in the rest of the country. So assuming there are planners, particularly from Maryland, but from across the country, don't think that this is just New Orleans. This is going to happen, and if it's not already happening in your communities. So listen to the recommendations, listen to what happened, and try to start thinking in advance of what you're going to be facing. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much. This concludes today's webinar, Post-Disaster Housing Resilience in Greater New Orleans. Although we didn't get to everyone's question, as I said, we'll share the submitted questions with the speakers following the webinar. I would like to offer my sincerest gratitude to our wonderful speakers for joining us today and for sharing their work on these important issues. Thank you to everyone who attended, and as always, thank you to Cassandra, who helped keep our webinar running smoothly. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted online. It will not be posted today because of the Labor Day holiday. It may be delayed. When you exit today's webinar, you will be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so we can continue to improve the webinar experience. Only those who indicated that they require a certificate during registration will receive one via email following the webinar. They will be sent out in a couple of days. As I said, there may be a delay. Please keep an eye on your inbox for details on future webinars sponsored by the Maryland Department of Planning and the Smart Growth Network. Thank you for joining us today, and have a great Labor Day weekend. Thank you.